The cellar smelled like tallow candles burning too low, spilled whiskey, and something older underneath it all. Stone that had absorbed too many years of quiet desperation to ever smell clean again. Bernice had stopped noticing it a long time ago. But sometimes, when a new rogue stumbled through the hidden door at the top of the stairs and caught their first lungful of the place, she watched their face instead of their hands. Watched the exact moment their shoulders came down from around their ears, the way their eyes, red-rimmed, darting, hunted, would briefly go soft. Not with joy, not quite with peace, with the particular relief of someone who had stopped running just for one night. That smell meant, here, you are no one's prey. She wiped down the bar counter for the 4th time that hour. Her hands moved in slow, practiced circles, the cloth following the same worn grain in the wood it always did. The rhythm was automatic now, the kind of motion that kept her hands busy so her mind didn't go somewhere it couldn't come back from. The cellar stretched out before her in amber half-light. Low arched ceiling, rough stone walls, candles jammed into bottlenecks lining every surface. A handful of oil lamps swung on iron hooks between exposed timber beams. The tables were mismatched, some square, some round, 2 that were simply wide planks laid across stacked crates. Every chair was different from the one beside it. Everything here had been dragged in, handed over, or quietly left behind by someone who understood what it meant to own nothing you didn't fight for. It wasn't beautiful. It was real. And in Bernice's experience, those 2 things rarely coexisted. Before we continue, please hit the subscribe and like button and tell me which city you're tuning in from. I love to know where this story found you. Now, let's dive in. Iris came out from the back room the way she always did, without announcing herself, without asking permission, carrying a stock pot that smelled of herbs and salted bone broth. She was 63 years old, gray-haired, built like someone who had survived 3 different kinds of war and found all of them personally insulting. She set the pot on the iron stand by the wall and gave Bernice a long, measured look. "You haven't eaten today." "I ate this morning." "Coffee is not a meal, Wren." Wren. The name settled against her the way it always did, slightly off-center, like wearing a coat that almost fit. 5 years, and it still wasn't fully hers. But that was the point of it. Wren had no brother. Wren had no history that could be found in Crown records or judgment court transcripts. Wren existed only here, below the city, in candlelight. Bernice had buried the rest of herself so that Wren could survive. Iris made a sound that was somewhere between amusement and judgment. "You're the worst liar I've ever met, and I've met pack enforcers." Before Bernice could answer, the door at the top of the stairs groaned open. Both women looked up. 4 figures descended. A man with a makeshift bandage around his forearm, already soaked through. A woman clutching a teenage girl against her side, one hand pressed flat over the girl's ear the way a mother does when she doesn't want her child to hear her own heartbeat. A 4th figure behind them, older, limping, his jaw set against whatever pain he was refusing to acknowledge out loud. Newly displaced, all of them. Bernice was already moving before they reached the bottom step. "Sit wherever you want," she said, her voice low and even, the same tone she always used, the one that was meant to sound like the room itself, not a person in it. "No names, no payment tonight. Food's coming." The woman's eyes filled. She pressed her lips together and nodded, not trusting herself to speak. They found a table near the far wall, the one with the best sightlines to the door, the one all the new arrivals chose instinctively. And Iris was already moving toward them with bread and water before they'd settled into their seats. This was why it existed, this moment, repeated over and over in candlelight. Cale would have understood. The thought came the way her brother always did, without warning, without mercy, sharp and sudden and total, like something cold pressed directly against a bruise. 5 years since the Alpha King had executed him in the judgment courtyard of the capital. No cameras, no human courts, no record that the outside world would ever find. Just ancient shifter law and the witnesses who carried it like a wound that never fully closed. 5 years since Bernice had built this place out of grief and fury and the absolute refusal to let his death mean nothing. She pressed her palm flat against the counter, breathed until the ache dulled back to something she could carry. Above her, the city roared on, indifferent. Below it, in a cellar built on loss, the door at the top of the stairs creaked open one more time. She looked up, and the world she had built so carefully around her grief began, very quietly, to fracture. He was the last one through the door that night. The others before him had come in the way rogues always did, hunched, wary, moving close to the walls. This one didn't. He descended the stairs at a measured pace, one hand resting at his side, the other loose near the folds of his charcoal cloak. His hood was pulled forward enough to shadow his face, but not enough to suggest he was hiding. More like he'd simply decided the world didn't need to see him clearly. The difference was subtle. The effect was not. Bernice noticed it before she understood it. Her hands slowed on the glass she was drying. Something in her chest pulled taut like a cord being tested. Across the room, the low hum of conversation dipped. Not all at once, nothing so obvious as that. Just a slight, collective recalibration. A man near the door shifted in his seat. Old Marsh, who hadn't looked up from his cards in 3 hours, glanced over once and then very deliberately looked away. The stranger found a stool at the far end of the bar and sat. His back was to nothing. Both exits were in his sight line. Bernice set the glass down and walked toward him. "What can I get you?" He looked up. The candlelight caught the edge of a jaw, the shadow of dark eyes. Not golden, or at least not visibly so in the low light. His expression was composed in the way that took practice, the kind of stillness that wasn't natural, but had been built. "Whiskey," he said. "Neat." She poured without speaking, set the glass between them. He wrapped one hand around it and didn't drink. Just held it. She moved away, came back twice in the next hour on the ordinary business of the bar. He had barely touched the whiskey. He wasn't watching the room the way men who were afraid watched a room. He was watching it the way someone watches something they're responsible for. She didn't like how much she noticed that. The second night, he came back. Same stool, same sight lines. He ordered the same drink and held it the same way. "You have a name?" she asked during a lull. A pause, just long enough to mean the answer he gave wasn't the one he was born with. "Darian." "Darian?" she repeated, as though weighing it. "And you're Wren." A statement, not a question. He'd been listening. "That's right." He looked at her directly then. There was something in it she didn't have a word for. Not attraction, not calculation, more like recognition. Like he was looking at something he'd already been told about and was now verifying for himself. Her wolf stirred. She walked away before either of them could say anything else. That night, she dreamed of smoke and a voice she couldn't quite place, saying her real name. She woke up with her pulse in her throat and lay still until it steadied. On the third night, he asked her, quietly, between other conversations, as if it were barely a question at all, "Why do you run a place like this?" "Someone has to." That's not an answer. It's the only one I have tonight. He accepted that, didn't push, just nodded once and returned to his vigil over the room. She noticed he'd moved slightly closer along the bar. She noticed she hadn't moved away. It was nearly the end of the fourth night when a young rogue, 17, maybe 18, all sharp elbows and unearned bravado, started getting loud at a table near the back. Another man was leaning over him, bigger, older, the kind of pressure that didn't need words. Darian set his glass down. He didn't stand. He simply turned on his stool and looked. That was all. The older man felt it. Bernice watched his posture change, the subtle lock of a prey animal that has just understood something about the room it's in. He straightened, muttered something, and found somewhere else to be. The young rogue never even saw it happen. Darian turned back to the bar. Bernice said nothing, but she was still watching him when the door at the top of the stairs opened and 3 men came down who had nothing to do with refuge. She knew the type before they hit the bottom step, and she felt, rather than saw, Darian go very still. The 3 men moved through the cellar like they owned the floor beneath it. Silver-lined jacket cuffs, that particular unhurried walk that men practiced when they wanted you to understand that hurrying was beneath them. The rogues near the door went quiet first, then the ones further back, silence spreading outward like something dropped into still water. The tallest one reached the bar and planted both hands on the counter. "Word's gotten around," he said pleasantly, "about this little operation." Bernice kept her expression exactly where it was. "We're a private gathering. You're welcome to leave." He smiled. It didn't reach anything above his mouth. "See, that's the thing about private gatherings in Crown territory. They stop being private the moment someone decides they're worth taxing. We have nothing worth taking. Let me be the judge of that." He leaned forward. "Weekly payment keeps us from mentioning you to the kind of people who ask questions you don't want to answer." She held his gaze. "No." The smile stayed. His hand shot across the counter and closed around her wrist. The grip was hard and deliberate, the kind meant to remind you what someone else's strength felt like against your bones. "Wrong answer," he said softly. The cellar went very quiet, and then the air changed. It didn't happen with sound or movement. It happened the way pressure changes before a storm. A shift in the atmosphere so complete and sudden that the body understood it before the mind caught up. Bernice felt it move through the room like a wave passing through the floor itself. Alpha dominance, not leashed, not measured, released. The effect was immediate and total. The 2 men flanking the collector staggered. Rogues at the tables went down, some to their knees, some gripping the edges of their chairs, heads bowing with an instinct older than choice. Old Marsh slid from his stool. The young rogue from the night before pressed both palms flat to the floor. The collector's hand went slack around her wrist. His knees buckled. He caught himself on the counter and stood there trembling, color draining from his face, his body trying to process a command his mind hadn't issued. Bernice felt it too. The instinct hit the base of her spine like a hammer. Bow, yield, submit. And for one unsteady second, the pressure was immense. Her knees softened. She locked them, dug her feet into the stone floor, and kept her spine straight through sheer, furious will. At the far end of the bar, Darian stood. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't moved toward anyone. He simply stood, hood still up, one hand resting on the counter, and let every ounce of what he was pour into the room unchecked. His eyes, in the candlelight, burned. "Leave," he said. One word. The kind that didn't require repetition. The collector pushed off the counter. He looked at Darian the way men looked at things that rearranged their understanding of the world, with fear wearing the borrowed mask of anger. He jerked his head at his men. They were up the stairs before he was. He followed without looking back. The door shut. Silence pressed in thick and ringing. Slowly, the room began to breathe again. Rogues found their feet. No one spoke. No one looked at him directly. Bernice walked to the end of the bar. "You're not rogue," she said. "No." Simple, flat, carrying no apology. "What are you?" He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved behind his eyes, not evasion exactly. More like a man choosing which truth to give when he couldn't give the real one. "Someone passing through," he said. He set a coin on the bar beside his untouched glass, pulled his hood forward, and walked to the stairs. She didn't call after him. She didn't have the words for what she wanted to ask, only the feeling, a hollow, urgent pull in her chest that had nothing to do with the confrontation and everything to do with him walking toward the door. That night, lying on her cot in the small room behind the cellar, she stared at the ceiling and waited for sleep that didn't come. The ache sat in her sternum like something lodged. Not grief, not fear, worse. She pressed her fist against her ribs and breathed. Her wolf paced in restless, relentless circles beneath her skin, and she understood, with the cold clarity of someone who'd survived too much to lie to herself, that the stranger was not passing through, and that she was in serious trouble. He came back the next night, and the night after that. Bernice stopped pretending she wasn't watching for him. She told herself it was caution, that a man with that kind of power warranted monitoring. It was a reasonable explanation. She repeated it until it almost sounded true. He always arrived within the same hour, always chose the same stool, always ordered whiskey he barely drank, and always, without fail, positioned himself where both exits were visible and no one could approach from behind. That wasn't the behavior of a rogue. That was the behavior of someone who had spent years in rooms where being caught unaware meant not leaving. On the fifth night, he arrived to find the cellar unusually crowded. A family of 4 had come in, the children asleep on a bench in the corner, the parents eating in the particular silent way of people who hadn't had a meal they didn't have to fight for in some time. Darian took his usual stool and watched the children sleep for a long moment before he looked away. His expression, in that unguarded second, was devastating. Bernice looked down at the counter and said nothing. Later, when the crowd thinned, she found herself at his end of the bar without quite deciding to go there. "Oh, you're not from the city," she said. "No, but you know it well enough. I've made it my business to." She studied the line of his jaw, the way he held himself even sitting down, a kind of controlled stillness that looked like relaxation but wasn't. "You've made a lot of things your business." The corner of his mouth shifted, not quite a smile, the suggestion of one briefly considered and then set aside. "I've made mistakes," he said quietly. The kind that take longer to repair than they did to make. It was the most he'd offered in 5 nights. She treated it carefully. "Haven't we all?" "Not like mine." She let that sit between them. Then, because the cellar was dim and it was late and the ache in her chest had worn down some of her defenses, she said, "The system that made this place necessary, it didn't happen by accident. Someone built it. Someone upheld it, and the people who paid the price were the ones who never had a seat at the table where the decisions got made." She wasn't looking at him when she said it. She was wiping down the counter, her voice measured and even. "Someone you knew?" he asked. "Someone I lost." He was quiet for a long moment. "I'm sorry." "Don't be sorry," she said. "Be different." She felt his eyes on the side of her face, but didn't turn. Iris cornered her the following afternoon in the back room while Bernice was taking inventory. "The hooded one," Iris said without preamble. "What about him?" "He carries authority the way you carry grief, like something he was born into and can't put down." She crossed her arms. Power doesn't visit places like this without a reason, Ren. It doesn't choose to sit at our bar. It gets sent. Or it comes hunting. He's not hunting anyone here. You're certain of that? Bernice wasn't certain of anything except that every hour he wasn't in the cellar felt longer than it should, and that the bond she wasn't naming was growing teeth. I'm watching him. Iris gave her a look that said she saw considerably more than she was being told. She left without pushing further. That night, near closing, he asked her a question she wasn't ready for. If a king changed, he said carefully, staring at his glass, truly changed, would you believe it was possible? The bar was nearly empty. The candles were burning low. No, she said. Why not? She looked at him directly. Because the thing that makes someone a king is the same thing that makes change impossible. They've never had to pay a price that mattered. Something crossed his face. On there and gone. What if they had? Then they wouldn't be a king anymore. They'd just be a person. She picked up his glass. And people are a different conversation. He opened his mouth, closed it, left without finishing his drink. The following night, he didn't come. Bernice wiped the counter until the cloth wore thin, watched the door until the candles guttered out, and lay awake until dawn pressed grey light under the cellar door. The ache in her chest had become something with edges. She pressed her palm against her sternum and breathed. Her wolf did not pace this time. It howled. The second night without him was worse than the first. Bernice knew it would be. That was almost the worst part. The knowing. The bond didn't care about her reasons or her history, or the careful architecture of self-possession she'd spent 5 years constructing. It simply wanted, with a blind, relentless pull that made her furious at her own biology. She served drinks. She checked on the family from 3 nights ago. Still here, the mother helping Iris in the kitchen now, the children drawing on scraps of paper in the corner. She did the work. She kept her hands moving and her expression neutral and her voice steady for every rogue who needed it to be. And every time the door at the top of the stairs groaned open, something in her chest lurched. Every time it wasn't him, something settled back into an ache that was getting harder to breathe around. Iris watched her from across the room and said nothing. That, more than anything, what told Bernice how visible she was becoming. She was behind the bar near midnight, writing inventory numbers she would not remember in the morning when she heard it. Boots, multiple sets, moving in unison, not the stumbling descent of rogues, not the lazy swagger of collectors, precision, coordination, the sound of people trained to move like a single organism. She looked up. The door at the top of the stairs didn't creak this time. It came open hard and fast, and they poured through it. 6 of them, silver insignias catching the candlelight, hands on weapons, moving to cover the room's corners before anyone below had time to process what was happening. Royal Guard. The cellar erupted. A man knocked over his table, getting to his feet. 2 rogues bolted for the secondary exit in the back passage and found it already covered. The mother in the kitchen screamed once, short and sharp, and then went silent in the way that meant she was protecting her children. Old Marsh stood from his stool with a blade in his hand that Bernice had not known he was carrying. Nobody move. The guard at the front had a voice built for commands in large spaces. By order of the crown, this gathering is... Stand down. The voice came from the top of the stairs. Every guard in the room went still. Bernice's hand found the knife under the bar. Her eyes moved to the stairs. He descended without hurry. No hood, no charcoal cloak pulled forward to shadow his face. The hood was back, and the cloak was open, and at his collar, catching the light of every candle in the room, was the insignia she had spent 5 years learning to hate on sight. Not noble, not merely alpha, crown. His face was fully visible for the first time. Sharp jaw, dark eyes that she now understood had not been shadowed by the hood so much as restrained by it. A bearing that had not changed at all since the first night he sat at her bar, because it had never been posture. It had simply been what he was. The guards nearest him dropped to one knee, then the others, in sequence, like something toppling. The room tilted sideways. "Your Majesty." The words fell into the silence like stones into deep water. Bernice did not move, did not breathe, stood with her hand around the knife under the bar and felt the world she had built very carefully around the shape of her grief begin to come apart at the seams. The rogues were frozen. Iris stood in the kitchen doorway with both hands pressed flat against the frame. He looked across the room, at her, only her. His expression was not the composed mask she had catalogued across 5 nights of careful watching. It was something rawer than that, something that, on any other face, she might have called dread. The mate bond pulled savagely between them. She barely felt it. "You," she said. Her voice came out very quiet, very even, the kind of quiet that had nothing to do with calm. He took one step toward her. She did not move back. She stood her ground with the knife in her hand and looked at the face of the Alpha King, Darian, who was not Darian, who had sat at her bar for 5 nights and held her gaze and asked her if kings could change. "You killed him." The words left her like something that had been waiting a long time to become sound. The guards didn't move until he told them to. That was the thing she kept snagging on. Even as the room tilted around her, they had stormed her cellar, terrified her people, and they stood there in their silver-marked uniforms, waiting for his permission to breathe differently. "Leave us." His voice was different without the hood, fuller. It carried the particular resonance of someone who had given commands in large stone rooms for a very long time. The guards hesitated. "That is an order." They went, single file, back up the stairs, pulling the door shut behind them. The rogues stayed frozen, some still half kneeling, some pressed against the walls, all of them watching with the wide, careful eyes of people who had learned that stillness was survival. Bernice didn't move from behind the bar. The Alpha King stood in her cellar in a charcoal traveling cloak, crown insignia at his collar catching the candlelight, and looked at her with something in his golden eyes that had no business being there. She knew that face. She had memorized it 5 years ago across a judgment courtyard, committing every line of it to the part of her memory reserved for things she needed to never forget. "You were in my bar," she said. Her voice came out quieter than she intended. "For 9 nights. You sat at my bar. Yes. You watched me. Yes. You let me—" She stopped, pressed the words flat. "You lied to me." "I withheld the truth," he said carefully. "I came disguised because I needed to understand what I had done. I needed to see it. The system I uphold created this place. Your bar exists because my rule failed the people in it. Don't." The word came out sharp. "Don't make yourself the protagonist of this." He didn't flinch. I'm not. You executed my brother." "Yes." The simplicity of it hit her harder than a denial would have. She gripped the edge of the counter. "He stood in that courtyard, and he begged," she said. "I was there. I watched from the upper passage because I wasn't permitted to stand beside him. He told them why he'd done it. He told them about the children. He asked for mercy." Her voice cracked on the last word, and she hated it, hated him for making her crack it. "And you swung the blade anyway." "I believed the charges were legitimate." His jaw was tight. "I was wrong. I was deliberately misled." "By whom?" He reached into his cloak and withdrew a sealed document, heavy with official wax. He set it on the bar between them. A council member named Aldrich Vane fabricated the evidence against your brother. He had financial interest in the territorial purge your brother's sheltering disrupted. The falsified documentation was thorough enough that it passed 3 levels of review. He paused. Vane confessed under interrogation 6 weeks ago. The full account is in that file. She stared at the seal, didn't touch it. Where is he now? Executed 3 weeks ago. The silence that followed was the specific kind that had weight in it, not empty, but loaded past capacity. And my brother? She asked. The Alpha King said nothing. The silence answered. She felt it move through her like something structural giving way. The last wall she'd built the rest of herself around, fracturing at the foundation. She didn't make the decision consciously. It rose from somewhere beneath reason, or from the part of her that had been carrying this for 5 years without putting it down once. I reject this bond. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. Pain detonated through her chest, not metaphorical, not emotional, physical, savage. Like something load-bearing had been seized and wrenched in opposing directions simultaneously. Her vision whited at the edges, her knees dissolved. Across the bar, the Alpha King staggered as though struck by the same blow. His hand shot out to the counter. A sound left him, brief, involuntary, the sound of a man absorbing serious damage. The floor came up. She didn't reach it. His arms caught her before she hit the stone, one hand behind her head, and he went down with her, not catching her from above, but coming down, kneeling on the cellar floor, holding her against his chest with the kind of grip that had nothing regal in it. "Don't," he said, his voice stripped of every layer of king. "Don't do this. You don't get to tell me." The pain swallowed the rest of it. "You will kill yourself." "Good." She could barely breathe. "Then you'll know what it feels like." A long, terrible silence. "I already live with that pain," he said quietly. The candlelight guttered. Neither of them moved. She came back to herself in pieces. First the cold of the stone floor beneath her, then the weight of her own breathing, shallow, uneven, the aftermath of pain that had been total. Then voices, low, careful, the particular hush of a room full of people who didn't know whether what they'd witnessed was the beginning or the end of something. She opened her eyes. Darius was crouched beside her, close, but not touching. His hood was gone. His crown insignia caught the candlelight at his collar. He looked like a man waiting for a verdict. Bernice sat up without his help. He let her. She got to her feet slowly, one hand briefly on the counter for balance, and turned to face the room. A dozen rogues watched her from their tables and the walls they'd pressed themselves against when the guards came through. Their expressions ran the full range: fear, confusion, a simmering anger looking for somewhere to land. Old Marsh stood near the back with his arms folded. The family with the children had moved the kids behind them. The young rogue from the corner was on his feet, jaw set, eyes moving between Bernice and the man standing in the middle of his sanctuary. The Alpha King, standing in a cellar built from grief, without his guards. Him without his hood, looking for the first time, like someone who understood exactly what that meant. Bernice crossed her arms. "Say what you came to say." Darius turned to face the room. He didn't perform the moment. He didn't modulate his voice into something ceremonial. When he spoke, it was simply and directly, like a man reading a debt aloud. Every rogue conviction issued under the territorial purge will be reviewed, individually, by an independent panel, not the council that issued them. A pause. Sanctuaries operating below ground across the kingdom will be granted legal recognition under royal protection, effective within the fortnight. Silence. Rogue integration, housing, work rights, medical access, a formal framework, built with input from rogue representatives. He stopped. These are not proposals. They are decisions already made. For a moment, no one moved. Then a man near the far wall, weathered, silver-scarred along his neck, said flatly, "That's a pretty speech from the man who built the cage." A murmur of agreement moved through the room. "It's manipulation," said another voice. "Wait until the heat dies down, then tighten the leash again. We've seen it." Darius didn't flinch. "You're right to doubt it." That landed differently. The murmuring stopped. "I upheld a system that criminalized survival," he said. "I trusted a council I should have audited. I signed orders that displaced people who had done nothing except exist without pack protection. I cannot undo that." He let the silence hold. "But I will spend however long it takes proving that something different is possible. Not because it serves the crown, because it's owed." Bernice watched him from the bar. She had heard kings speak before, in broadcasts, in formal addresses, in the clipped language of law being handed down like weather. This wasn't that. This was a man in a cellar without his armor, saying true things to people who had every reason not to believe them. She hated how much it cost him. She hated more that she could see it. "You want their trust," she said, loud enough for the room. "You don't ask for it. You come back, and you come back again. And when the reform hits resistance from your own court, and it will, you hold the line anyway." "Yes," he said. "Don't agree with me yet. I haven't finished." She pushed off the bar and walked toward him, stopping a few feet away. "This place exists because your system failed every person in this room. That doesn't get rewritten because you showed up without your hood. You don't get to be the ending of their story. I know that. Then what do you want?" He held her gaze, and then, without ceremony, without calculation, he lowered himself to one knee, not as a king performing contrition, not as a man making a political gesture, as something older and quieter than either. The room went absolutely still. Bernice's breath caught. "I want the chance to be worth standing next to," he said. For a long moment, she didn't move. Then she turned to the room, to Marsh, to the scarred man, to the family pressed against the wall, to the young rogue with his jaw still set and his hands still fists. "Nobody owes him anything," she said clearly. "Not yet." She looked back at Darius. "Get up." He rose. "You can stay," she said. For now." It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't close to forgiveness. But in a cellar built on loss, it was the first thing that felt like ground. The royal seal went up on the cellar door 3 days later. Bernice had stared at it for a long time before going back inside. It was a small thing, wax and gold pressed into wood. But in 5 years of running this place in darkness, the idea that something official now acknowledged its existence felt like standing in a room where the walls had shifted 6 inches without warning. The rogues who came through that week moved differently, lighter, some of them. Others came in suspicious, as though the seal itself might be a trap designed to catalog their faces. Bernice couldn't tell them it wasn't. She could only keep the bread coming and the candles lit and let the place be what it had always been. Word traveled faster than she'd hoped and in more directions than she'd planned. On the 5th night after the announcement, Iris came to find her in the back room. "Someone's been watching the street entrance," she said quietly. 2 men. Different shifts. They're not rogues." Bernice was on her feet before Iris finished. She'd barely made it to the bar when the door at the top of the stairs came off its hinges. Not opened, off its hinges. 3 men in unmarked dark clothing came through fast and low, and behind them 2 more, and the rogues in the cellar scattered, Chairs scraping, someone shouting, a table going over, no silver insignias, no uniforms. The kind of men who were paid specifically to leave nothing that could be traced back to a council chamber. Bernice reached under the bar. In the chaos, she almost missed the child, the small girl from the family who'd been coming every night for a week, who always sat in the corner with a cup of warm broth and fell asleep before her parents finished eating. She'd been left at her table when the panic started, too frightened to move, pressed flat against the wall with her knees drawn up and her eyes enormous. Bernice vaulted the bar. She got to the girl in 4 steps, pulled her in close, and turned her back to the room just as something silver-edged cut the air where her head had been a breath before. She felt the wind of it against her cheek, and then a body stepped between her and the man who'd thrown it, Darius. He caught the second blade on his forearm rather than let it reach her. She heard the sound it made and felt him absorb it. A sharp, controlled exhale, nothing more. And then he had the man's wrist, and the fight was over in seconds. The others were already retreating. Whatever they'd expected, it hadn't been him. Not without guards, not moving like that. They went back up the stairs the way they'd come, fast and silent, and then there was only the wreckage of overturned furniture and the cellar full of shaken rogues and Darius standing in the middle of it with Silver scoring a deep line across his left forearm. Silver didn't just wound shifters, it stayed in the wound, resisted healing, burned through the body's ability to close itself. He'd known that when he stepped in front of her.
Bernice handed the girl to Iris without speaking and crossed the cellar. She took his arm without asking permission and turned it toward the nearest light. The wound was long and already inflamed, the edges darkening in the way silver wounds did when they weren't treated fast. "Sit down," she said. "I'm fine." "You're not." She pulled him toward the back room. "Sit down." He sat. She worked in silence, cleaning the wound, drawing out what silver she could with a poultice Iris brought without being asked. Her hands were steady. She'd learned long ago to keep her hands steady when everything else wasn't. He watched her face while she worked. "You didn't have to do that," she said finally, her voice low. "Yes, I did." She pressed the cloth against the wound harder than she needed to and felt him hold still for it. "Council loyalists."
They'll try again, probably. And next time you might not. She stopped. The words sat in her throat, unfinished and too honest. She pressed her lips together and focused on the bandaging. "If you die," she said carefully, "nothing changes. The reform dies with you. Every person in that room goes back to living underground indefinitely." He was quiet for a moment. "Is that the only reason you'd care?" She tied off the bandage and didn't answer. He looked at her, not pressing, just looking, the way he'd looked at her from the very first night, like he was reading something written underneath the words she wasn't saying. "Bernice," he said quietly, "if I died, it changes everything." She finally looked up. His eyes, gold lit in the lamplight, held nothing calculated, no performance. Just a man telling her the plain truth of what he understood about himself and about her and about the terrible, inconvenient territory that existed between them. She held his gaze for 3 seconds longer than she meant to. Then she stood, set down the cloth, and walked back out to her cellar. But her hands, for the first time in 5 years, were not entirely steady. Dawn came slowly to the cellar. It didn't arrive with light. The stone walls didn't allow for that. But Bernice felt it the way she always did. A gradual easing in the quality of the dark, the candles burning lower and softer, the particular silence of a city shifting from its nighttime self to its daytime one somewhere far above her head. The rogues who remained had stayed through the night. Some slept at tables. Iris had covered the children with the spare blankets from the back room and was dozing upright in her chair by the door, arms still folded, as if even sleep hadn't convinced her to fully stand down. Old Marsh sat awake near the back wall, turning his cards over one at a time without playing any game Bernice recognized. Darius had not left. He sat at the far end of the bar with his bandaged arm resting on the counter and his eyes open, watching the room settle into its quiet, the way he watched everything, with that absolute weighted attention that had unsettled her the first night and had since become something she couldn't imagine the room without. She poured 2 cups of the bitter grain coffee Iris kept for emergencies and set one in front of him without speaking. He wrapped his good hand around it. They sat in silence for a while. The candles burned. Someone across the room murmured in their sleep. "The formal documentation came through last night," he said eventually. "Before the attack, the sanctuary designation is registered with the Crown Office. It cannot be revoked without parliamentary challenge." A pause. "I made sure it couldn't be quiet." Meaning I made it public record before I came here. If someone wants to undo it, they'll have to do it in full view. She looked at him. "You did that before you knew whether I'd let you back through the door." "Yes." She turned her cup slowly in her hands. Outside, somewhere above the stone, a bird began. He set his cup down. "I want to make a formal mate claim," he said. "Not with ceremony. Not with the weight of a king issuing terms. Quietly, like a man saying something he'd been carrying too long to keep carrying alone. I'm not asking you to forgive what I've done. I'm not asking you to come to the capital or stand beside a throne or be anything other than what you already are." He looked at her steadily. "I'm asking to be counted as yours, whatever that means to you, on your terms, in whatever form you'll allow." The cellar was very still. Bernice looked at him for a long moment. At the man who had sat at her bar for 9 nights and watched her with gold eyes and stepped between her and a silver blade without hesitating and knelt on her stone floor, not as a king, but as something more difficult than that. "This bond does not erase history," she said. "I know. My brother is still dead. The years this place had to exist in hiding are still years that happened. The people in this room are still carrying wounds your system gave them. Yes, you don't get credit for undoing damage as if the damage was a mistake you made in a ledger. These were lives. I know that too." She held his gaze. "You earn tomorrow," she said. "That's all I'm offering. One day at a time. Nothing guaranteed." Something moved through his expression. Not relief, not triumph. Something quieter and more serious than either. The look of a man who understood exactly the weight of what he was being handed and intended to be worthy of it. "That's enough," he said. She nodded once. Then she stood, turned to face the room, and raised her voice just enough to reach the corners. "Wake up." The cellar stirred. Heads lifted from tables. Iris opened her eyes immediately, as if she'd never fully closed them. The children blinked. Old Marsh set down his cards. The young rogue straightened in his chair. They looked at her. Some of them looked at him. "The seal on that door is real," Bernice said. "This place is legal now. You don't have to come in hunched. You don't have to leave before dawn." She let that settle. "And you don't owe anyone in this room a bowed head. Not me, not him." She glanced at Darius. He remained standing, still, no gesture of authority, no expectation. "No one kneels here," she said. The words landed the way they always did, not as a rule, but as a reminder of something that should never have needed saying. Slowly, the room rose. Not in deference, not in ceremony, simply in the quiet dignity of people who had been told and believed that they were allowed to stand. Darius watched them, and then he watched her, the way he always watched her, with something in his gold eyes that had no political use whatsoever. He had not come for the crown's sake. He had not come to manage a problem or contain a threat or demonstrate reform for public record. He had come because the bond had led him here, and what he found had remade him. And he understood now, in the grey candlelit dawn of a cellar built on grief, that the only thing worth building a kingdom around was already standing behind that bar. Not forgiveness, not yet, not submission, not ever, but something that had begun in ashes and was, against all reasonable expectation, still burning. He would spend every tomorrow making himself worthy of it. That, finally, was enough to start. If you enjoyed this story, let me know in the comments. Your support decides what tale the moon whispers next.